So today's lesson is called Subtracting Integers, and today by the end of the lesson you'll be able to subtract an integer. Now, the correct way or the definition to subtract an integer is to add its opposite. So I'd like this in your notes and watch and see the examples we're going to be doing how to add its opposite. Now the first example is an algebraic example. Basically in math we let these letters represent any type of number, so it's just kind of letting us know that's going to work either way. So basically what I'm asking, or what I'm telling you is A, we're subtracting B from it. Now to subtract an integer we're going to add its opposite. So since I have an A here, it stays an A. My B, I'm adding its opposite. What's the opposite of a positive B? A negative B, and I'm adding it. So this is the algebraic way, or basically a very technical math way of proving it. Now, another example of how to add its opposite. So, let's say I gave you 7 minus 10. Now my 7 is going to stay the same. What am I going to be adding? I should be adding, what's the opposite of a 10? That negative 10. So watch and see what the answer is going to be. It's end up being a 7 plus a negative 10. Now, let's look at our second example. What happens when you have that double negative? I went a little fast, but what's 8 minus a minus 5? So I'm adding. Now I have to add its opposite. If I started with a negative 5, I end up with a positive 5. That's when we have those double negatives, they end up turning positive. So go ahead and write down this first example, and we're going to solve it. So we're going to rewrite the subtraction by adding its opposite. So just like before, my 6 just carries along. Then, of course, I am adding, so I put a plus sign. Now, what am I adding? I have a regular 2. What's the opposite of a regular 2? A negative 2. Now, one thing I would like you to do, though, which I didn't do in my first example, is put a little parentheses around it. That way you know that this is a negative 2. So then, we figure out, basically, what's 6 plus a negative 2, or, if you look, it should be 6 minus 2. What's 6 minus 2? It is 4. So this is something I want you to take away from it. 6 minus 2 is exactly the same thing as 6 plus a negative 2. Same thing, but all it is just written differently. Be aware, math can be tricky. We can say it one way, also say it another thing, but it's the same exact thing. Now, go and write down example number 2 and go and try to solve it. So with example number 2, my negative 4 stays the same. Then, remember, I was told I have to add its opposite, so I'm adding, make a better plus sign. I'm adding, now what am I adding? I started with a negative 10, my negative 10 should end up being a positive 10, and now I'm going to solve. Now, I don't like having my 10 in the back, so remember, we can rearrange this. This is 10 minus 4, my 10 still stays a positive, my 4 is still a negative, so I haven't changed any values. So what's 10 minus 4? 10 minus 4 is equal to 6. So we're solving by adding its opposite. Or, if you just like knowing that one rule that whenever there's two negatives, they turn into a positive, changing these both in positives, you may use that as well. So remember, ladies and gentlemen, big thing I want you to take away from it. Negative 4 minus a negative 10 is equal to a negative 4 plus 10. They are the same thing. Get used to things being written a little bit differently, but meaning the same exact thing. Same thing. Now in your notes, I want this. Is this a positive 5 or a plus 5? Looking at this, turn to your neighbor and tell them, do you think it's going to be a positive 5 or do you think it's going to be a plus 5? What do you think the answer is going to be? The answer was a trick answer. It is both of them. You can say it either way. You can call this a positive 5 or you can say it plus 5. Now, I know you've been brought up as being plus 5 or we're adding 5. I want you to get used to the term of a positive 5 because the plus sign is there, it's a positive. Now, if I just had a 5 right here, is it also positive 5? Yes, it is. This is also a positive 5. Sometimes I jump in, that positive will be there, sometimes it won't be there. Be aware there's multiple ways of saying it. So both of them are correct. Make sure this is in your notes. Now, the next thing I want in your notes, once again, I want you to go and write down that question. Is this a negative 7 or a minus 7? Turn to your neighbor. What do you think the answer is going to be? What do you think this term is? Once again, this is a trick answer. Both are correct. This is a -7. Another way of saying it is also a -7. You might even hear subtracting. Ooh, that's a bad A. Subtracting 7. Be aware of all these new terms. Now I know a lot of you are used to -7 or maybe subtracting 7, but I want you to be used to now the new term of negative. We're now starting to deal with positives and dealing with negatives. We're going to be less with the minus, less with the subtracting. And now, how do we know this is a negative? Because of that little symbol right in front of it. Now let's say I've just given you a regular 7. What do you think the 7 is going to be? It's going to be a +7. But that little sign is in front of it. What is it? It's a -7. So be aware of the terms. I'll be using a lot more negatives and a lot more positives. Make sure, well, let me erase this. Make sure this is in your notes as well. Now, for the next little bit, don't write, write it down. Just watch. So, I start with a 1. And it's equal to, now, what term would this be? This would be a +1. Now, how do I know it's positive? Because there's no other terms by it. So this is my +1. So by itself, it's just a +1. Now, if I have a positive times a positive, what do you think it's going to give me? Another positive. Now, in my example, I'm not putting there, don't you imagine that there's little parentheses all around them. It's a positive times a positive ends up with a positive. Then I get a positive times a negative. Now, what have you been taught? Positive times a negative is always a negative. Don't forget your little triangle, right? Plus, plus, minus. If I have a positive and negative, whoops, I wrote the triangle wrong. Plus, minus, minus. Here we go. Positive times a minus is going to give me a minus. Then I get the, where is it? A positive times a negative is also a negative. Now, how did I figure this one out? Well, I already knew a positive times a positive is a what? A positive. Then I threw in that negative. What's a positive times a negative? A negative. So that's how I knew a negative is going to be my answer. Doesn't matter how many positives there are. If there's one little negative, it's going to make the answer negative. So be aware of what's positive and what's negative. Now, what do you think the answer is going to be to this one? I have a positive, then a negative, then a positive. Any ideas what the answers might be? If you guessed that the answer was going to be a negative, you were correct. Now, why is it a negative? Well, let's go back to our little triangle. Oh, let me make a better triangle. Better triangle. My plus, minus, minus. So, I look at the first part. Positive times a negative. Do a positive times a negative, what do I get? I get a negative. So this is ends up being a negative plus a 1. And if I look, it looks exactly like that one. And what was the answer? -1. So -1 is also going to be my answer. Remember, it doesn't matter how many positives you have. If you have that one pesky negative, it's going to make your whole answer negative. And then what do we learn about double negatives? Double negatives are always going to be a positive. Now, negative times a positive times a positive times a negative. Turn to your neighbor. What do you think the answer is going to be? The answer ends up being a positive. Now you're like, whoa, 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 what happened? I had a negative. A negative should also mean a negative, right? Not necessarily. In this case, I have a negative times a positive, which is what? A negative. So I have a negative right here. But I also have another positive times a negative. What is that? It's also a negative. And what we just learned, a negative times a negative is a positive, so a positive is going to be my answer. You have to be very careful of your signs. So be careful of your signs. Because positive 1 is much better than a negative 1. To be very careful. Now, I have 3 negatives. What do you think the answer is going to be? The answer is going to be a -1. Now, why -1? Let's take a look. My first 2 negatives. I learned a negative and a negative is a what? A positive. So these become a positive. Bring down my negative. And then what I learned up here, what's a positive times a negative? A negative. So my answer is a -1, and that is what I get. Now, looking at my last example, I want you to turn to your neighbor. Try to explain to them, why is it that when I have 4 negatives, it's equal to a positive value? Why is that? The answer is in how we multiply. What's a negative times a negative? I learned that's a positive, so this becomes a plus. And once again, I have another set of double negatives. What's a negative times a negative? Well, it's a plus. And what's a plus times a plus? We learned up in the very beginning, it's going to be a positive. So this is a positive one. So once again, be careful of your signs. So this is what I want in your notes. If you have an odd number of negatives, it's going to give you a negative. If you have an even number of negatives, it's going to give you a positive. So I would like this box in your notes along with a couple examples. I would like this example in your notes and this example in your notes because it demonstrates odd number of negatives gives you a negative number. Even number of negatives gives you a positive number. You have to be very careful of what's negative because it dictates whether you can give a positive answer or a negative answer. And now we're going to do some example problems. So go and write down example number 1. So, just like before, we need to add its opposite. I start with a negative 8. I'm adding the opposite of a negative 5. So I'm adding, what? 5. And I don't like how this is written, but what I know my answer has to be, my answer has to be negative. Why? Because my 8 is bigger, so I put my negative out in front. Let's rewrite this to something nicer. 8 minus 5, which is going to give me a 3, but I have to make sure I don't lose that negative, so it becomes a negative 3. Or, if you like to do it the other way, you can always do it where when you recognize, when you see two negatives, they become a positive. Remember, we just learned that rule. So is there an even number of negatives to become positive? That's how I got my positive answer as well. Now let's go take a look at example number 2. Now example number 2, we're adding its opposite again. So I have 14 adding, what's the opposite of 7? Or negative 7, 7. I add them together, let's see, what's 14 plus 7? I get 21. Or, you should have also noticed that what's a negative times a negative? Remember, I have an even number of negatives. They turn positive. So 2 different ways of looking at it, whichever way you like to remember best. Now go and try example number 3 and example number 4 on your own. So looking at example number 3, my negative 6 stays the same. Since we're subtracting, I have to add its opposite. What's the opposite of negative 14? 14. Now I don't like how that's written. I like to put this bigger number in front of the 6. So I do 14 minus 6. Now I haven't changed any values. My 14 was a positive, it's still a positive. Negative 6 was a negative, still a negative. I haven't changed any values. Now, what's 14 minus 6? 14 minus 6 is 8. And remember, another way of looking at it. I have 2 negatives. 2 negatives are an even number, so I can change this to a positive, and it still would be negative 6 plus 14. Now let's take a look at example number 4. So I have a negative 7 plus, what's the opposite of negative 7? 7. Now, let's rewrite this. What's 7 minus 7? 7 minus 7 is 0. Now, this one you shouldn't have to rewrite. You should automatically recognize. If I have a negative version and a positive version, they cancel each other out, so it has to equal 0. Or if you'd recognized, you had 2 negatives, they're an even number. Negative times a negative becomes a positive. Now, going down example number 5. Now, example number 5, we have 3 terms now, so to be very careful of what we're doing. So, my negative 4 is never going to change, it's the first value. But if I notice, I am subtracting a negative 9. What's in the way of rewriting that? We're adding its opposite, and what's left over, that negative 3, well, that negative 3 just tags along. Now, another way that you could have recognized was, you saw that there was a double negative, even number, changing it into a positive. It's another recognizing how this became a positive 9. So now, let's simplify. Now I have a negative 4 plus 9. That's going to give me 5. My negative 3 still following along, so what's 5 minus 3? My answer is going to be 2. Now, go and write down example number 6 and try to solve it on your own. Now, example number 6. Slightly bigger numbers, still the same exact idea. So my negative 90 comes on down first. So I have my negative 90. Now, I have a negative and a negative. I'm subtracting, so that means I'm going to be adding its opposite. What's the opposite of negative 80? A positive 80. And then my negative 20 is just going to tag along as well. So I have my negative 20. Now remember, another way you can recognize is when there's 2 negatives, they're an even number. Since they're an even number, I can make them positive. So now let's combine what's left over here. So I have a negative 90 plus 80. Now 90 is the bigger term. Since 90 is the bigger term, I know it has to be a negative, so let's rewrite this. 90 minus 80 gives me 10. So I have a negative 10, and then I have a negative 20. Now, don't panic. I know that we have two different negatives, but what did we learn previously? If they are the same sign, what are you supposed to do? You're supposed to find the sum. So we're going to be adding them together. So what's 10 plus 20? That's going to give me 30, but what's wrong with my picture? Don't forget, they're both negatives. So that means my answer has to be negative as well. So I get negative 30 as my answer. So now I'd like to write me a two-sentence summary. What did we learn today? We learned how to subtract integers and how when we're multiplying negatives, what happens when there's a an even amount of negatives or an odd amount of negatives.